Okay. So hostile aggression is the type of aggression where if you are angry at someone, then will lash out and hit them or act in some aggressive way towards them. In other words, the point of the aggressive act is the aggressive act itself. Okay. This is sometimes referred to as hot aggression. And in social psychology, when we use terms like hot and cold or hot and cool, that usually means one of two things. It can mean either that something is infused with emotion, okay, or it's in some other way motivated in some way. So when we say hot aggression, what we mean is that it's infused with emotion. We're angry, and so we lash out. We're motivated to harm the other person. That's what hot aggression refers to. But it's not the only kind of aggression that exists. Instrumental aggression, in contrast to hostile aggression, refers to instances of aggression where the point of the aggression isn't the aggression itself. This occurs when people use aggression as a means to some other end. So the classic example of this would be something like if a hitman is paid $10,000 to kill someone, they don't care about the aggressive act itself. What they're doing is they're using aggression in order to get something else, in this case, in order to get money. So in contrast to hostile aggression, instrumental aggression is often referred to as cool or cold aggression. And that's because it's not as infused with emotion as hostile aggression. So when we're angry at someone and we hit them, that's hostile aggression. But if you think of the hitman, they're not angry at the person they're killing. They don't hate the person they're killing. They're just doing it for money. So in a sense, it's cold aggression because they're not experiencing emotions towards the person they're committing aggression against. And we use this distinction within social psychology, in part because the ways to reduce hostile aggression are different than the ways to reduce instrumental aggression. And so because one of the main goals that social psychologists have when researching aggression is to figure out ways to reduce aggression in the real world, it's important to distinguish between these two types of aggression that are motivated by different factors. It's not always the case, though, that every single behavior is either hostile or instrumental. There are certain behaviors that can be both hostile and instrumental. I'll give you a couple examples. So let's say that terrorists have kidnapped an American soldier, okay? And they threaten or they actually kill this person in order to try to force the United States to meet certain demands that they have, like maybe withdrawing troops from the country or something like that. Okay? That is mostly instrumental aggression because it's using aggression as a means to an end, to get something that they want. So in that sense, it's instrumental aggression. But if those terrorists truly hate American soldiers and they're angry at those American soldiers, then it could also be hostile aggression. Or as another example, if you take a look at a boxing match between two boxers. For the most part, boxing is instrumental aggression because the boxers are trying to, or they're using aggression, they're hitting the other person as a means to an end, the end being they want to win the fight, right? They don't hate the person necessarily that they're boxing. But if they do hate that person for whatever reason, then that behavior is not only instrumental, it's also hostile aggression for trying to inflict damage and trying to harm the other person as a means to an end, as an end in and of itself. So it can be both hostile and instrumental. Or if you've got this kitten who's been hired in order to kill dogs, again, they're being paid to kill dogs, so it's instrumental. But on the other hand, if the kitten actually hates those dogs, it would also be hostile aggression. Okay. There's one other distinction I want to make between two different kinds of aggression, and that is between physical aggression, which is what we're normally used to thinking about aggression. Physical aggression includes any sort of physical contact with someone else. So punching, pushing, kicking, biting, anything like that would count as physical aggression. But there's another kind of aggression that can be overlooked, but we shouldn't overlook it, and that is relational aggression. Relational aggression occurs when people try to harm someone else by damaging their social relationships, hence the name relational aggression. And there's a number of ways that people can try to damage someone's relationships with peers. But it could be something like gossiping or spreading rumors about someone. It could be if you've given someone the silent treatment, then you're trying to damage their relationships either with you or with friends. And if you go back to the operational definition of aggression that we've been using, what you should note from that definition is that nothing in the definition says that aggression has to be physical, right? It has to be a behavior that has the goal of harming another living being who's motivated to avoid that treatment, but the nature of the harm is left unspecified in that definition. And so the harm can be physical, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be relational. So if you try to spread rumors about someone to try to harm someone's reputation and their social standing, well, that's a behavior that's goal-oriented, trying to harm another person, another living being who's motivated to avoid it. So it meets all parts of that definition of aggression. And so relational aggression is also a form of aggression. We shouldn't overlook that. Relational aggression is particularly prevalent among, let's say, teenagers as opposed to adults, and particularly with girls as opposed to boys. And so if you look just at physical aggression, what we tend to see is that males tend to be more physically aggressive than females. But if you also include relational aggression, well, women tend to be more relationally aggressive than men. And if you look at all examples of aggression, men and women are roughly equally aggressive. It's just that they tend to exhibit it differently. Men tend to use aggression physically, and women tend to use aggression relationally. Obviously, there are all sorts of exceptions to this. These are just kind of general tendencies. Okay, so one question psychologists have, and not just psychologists, but this is a question that's been tackled by theologians and philosophers for hundreds of years, right? Thousands of years probably, which is this: is aggression biologically based? Are we biologically inclined to act aggressively? Or is aggression more of a learned behavior and we wouldn't normally be aggressive except for the fact that we've learned to use aggression? And as is almost always the case for almost any question like this, when you ask whether it's biologically based or learned, the answer is almost always both. And that's going to be true for aggression as well. There's contributions from both biology as well as from learning that lead to aggressive behavior. Let's take a look at these perspectives. Some people have suggested that humans are what they call noble savages. Now, what that means is that by savage, what I mean is someone who is uncorrupted by culture or society. Okay, so meaning someone who has not learned to behave aggressively yet. And so a noble savage would mean that in our natural state, before we're corrupted by society and culture, that we are good in nature. So the perspective that humans are noble savages suggests, or it is the idea that people are inherently good, and it's society and culture and learning that corrupts us to behave aggressively. And so the perspective that humans are a noble savage is captured by the statement by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, philosopher, who says the following: "So many authors have hastily concluded that man is naturally cruel and requires a regular system of police to be reclaimed, whereas nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state, when placed by nature at an equal distance from the stupidity of brutes and the pernicious good sense of civilized man." And the key here of the saying is this here: nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state. If we excuse the sexist language, what they're basically saying is that, naturally speaking, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, humans are naturally gentle and good. And it's society that corrupts, and we learn to behave aggressive, but in our natural state, we are actually non-aggressive and gentle. And this sort of philosophy is captured by, for instance, the idea behind Tarzan. Tarzan is a man who grew up in the jungle, outside of society, outside of other human culture, and as a consequence, he's the gentle giant of the jungle, right? He's this non-aggressive person in his natural primitive state. That's the basic idea. That's the philosophy behind Tarzan, basically. But this is only one perspective. Other people have taken the exact opposite perspective. For instance, another philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, said the following: "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war is as if of every man against every man." Now, what Hobbes is saying here is that without a common power to keep us in awe, we're in a condition called war, meaning we are naturally aggressive unless there's some common power like culture, society, some sort of societal system that keeps us in awe, that keeps us hanging together and not acting aggressively. So in contrast to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes is saying humans are naturally born aggressive, and we need society to keep us together, to keep us from behaving aggressively. And this sort of philosophy is captured in other works of art, like someone already mentioned it. Lord of the Flies is a great example of this. So if you haven't read the book Lord of the Flies, just as a brief synopsis, the premise of the book is that a plane crashes on an island, and the survivors are these boys. I think they're like, what are they, 12 or 13 or somewhere in there, somewhere around that age range. And basically what you've done is you've removed them from society, right? They're living alone on this island. There's no other adults around, there's no cultures, no society. They have to sort of rebuild society. And so over the course of the book, these boys get increasingly aggressive as they basically revert back to their natural state. So the basic philosophy behind Lord of the Flies is based on this idea that humans are naturally aggressive and cruel, and we need something like society to keep us in line, to keep us from behaving aggressively. Okay, so those are the two different philosophies, but of course, this is an empirical question. In other words, this is a question that we can test with certain metrics and certain studies to see if people have this inherent tendency towards aggression naturally, or if they tend to learn aggression. So let's look at what some of the research says. And I'm first presenting this first theory, which is Sigmund Freud's instinct theory of aggression, for historical reasons, but not because anyone actually takes it seriously today. Okay. Freud was hugely influential to the field of psychology for numerous reasons, but a lot of his specific theories, a lot of them don't really hold up, and people don't really take a lot of them seriously today, even though he was hugely influential in general. And this is one of those theories that no one really, I don't think, takes seriously today, but here's the basic idea behind his instinct theory of aggression. What Freud postulated is that just like we have an instinct to stay alive, which we tend to have, I mean, that's why you get scared, right, if you're in a life-threatening scenario, because our body's natural instinct is to try to keep us alive. Freud also thought that we have a death instinct, meaning we have an unconscious desire to be dead. Okay? Now, in general, usually this life instinct that we have balances out the death instinct. And so as a consequence, we don't just kill ourselves immediately because we have a life instinct that balances it out. However, under certain situations, that death instinct that we have, so this desire to be dead, instead of being directed towards us, it gets deflected outwards. So instead of aiming it at us, it's aimed at other people. And according to Freud, that's what aggression is. Aggression occurs when this natural death instinct, which is normally aimed at us, is instead deflected outwards towards other people. I found online actually some people who said that you can actually measure the strength of your own death instinct. Don't take this too seriously. Again, no one really buys into this, but I have seen an online website say that you can measure your death instinct by looking at your hand. And if there's a discrepancy between sort of those two chunky parts of your hand, if they're not even, then that says you have a strong death instinct. And if they're more even like this, it says you have a weak death instinct. It's all a bunch of nonsense, right? Don't actually believe this. But a much more influential, but I should go back and say, but the basic idea behind Freud's death instinct is that aggression in that theory is a biological behavior. We're born with that death instinct. It's biological. We didn't have to learn it at all. A much more, or a different theory that takes the perspective that aggression can be biological and is much more respected, although still controversial to some degree, is the evolutionary theory of aggression. Now remember that in the attraction section, we talked about the basics behind natural selection, right? So the basic idea here is that if you have a gene that makes you more likely to survive and have offspring, then that gene will spread through a population over many, many generations. And if you have a gene that tends to decrease your likelihood of surviving and reproducing and having offspring, that gene will die out over a number of generations. And so what that means is that the genes that we have in our bodies today should be those genes that helped our ancestors survive in the past. And so if it's the case that aggression is a biological behavior because it's somehow encoded in our genes, then that would suggest that aggression evolved because it helped our ancestors survive. So for instance, let's rewind the clock 100,000 years. And let's say that we have ancestors and some of them had a gene to be aggressive and some of them didn't. Now, if you didn't have a gene to be aggressive, okay, then what that means is, well, if you weren't aggressive, maybe you didn't go hunting. And if you didn't go hunting, you didn't have anything to eat. And so you died of starvation, right? On the other hand, if you were aggressive, then you would go hunting and you would kill animals and you would eat them and you're more likely to survive. And therefore, you're going to pass on that gene for being aggressive, right? So the basic logic is that if we have a biological imperative, a biological need sometimes to be aggressive today, it's because it helped our ancestors survive in the past. Now, that's a drastic oversimplification of what the theory states, but that's the basic general idea behind it. The evolutionary theory of aggression can be used to explain certain sex differences in aggression as well. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it is the case that although there aren't that many differences between men and women, there are a few differences. And one of those differences is in terms of physical aggression. So I alluded to the idea that men are more physically aggressive than women. And that's true in virtually every culture we've ever looked at. Okay. On average, of course. The evolutionary theory of aggression has an explanation for why that could be. And let me walk you through this explanation. And this explanation is based on the idea, which may not make sense at the beginning, but I'll explain it, that women tend to be choosier when having sexual partners than men are. And that is certainly true of humans, and it's true of a lot of animals, a lot of species. Not every species. There are some species where it's the reverse. But in many species, the majority of them that we've looked at, women tend to be choosier in terms of choosing their sexual partners than men are. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for why that's the case that I'm not going to go into for the sake of time, but just assume that that is true, okay? Well, the basic idea is that if women, I'll just use humans as an example, but the same logic applies to other animals. So if women are choosier when choosing a sexual partner, then what that means effectively is that the men have to compete with one another in order to gain access to the woman. It sounds weird when I explain it in terms of human terms, okay? So maybe it is better to think about this in terms of animals, where male animals really have to, in many cases, have to physically fight one another, and it's only if you win that fight are you able to mate with the female of that species. I'll give you an example. Okay. These are elephant seals. This black elephant seal in the back, that's a male, and the brown one up front is a female. And you should notice right off the bat that the black elephant seal is much larger than the smaller female, right? The male is larger than the female. You can see that as well here. In this case, it's the brown one, that's the male, and the black one is the female, and they have a little pup, little baby as well. But you generally tend to find that the males are much larger than the females. That's also true in humans, not quite to the same extent, but if you look at body mass or height, men are usually taller and larger than women. It's also true that in both humans and in elephant seals, and in most other species in which the men or the males are larger than the females, the males are also more aggressive, more physically aggressive than the females of that species. And that's certainly true of elephant seals as well. So in fact, these are two male elephant seals, and they will literally physically fight one another in these brutal fights, sometimes to the death, and only the winner is able to mate with the females. Okay, now the basic idea is that if it's the case that only the winner can mate with the females, then what that means is that if you have elephant seals who have a gene for being non-aggressive, right, for not fighting, they're never going to be able to mate because they can never win these battles. And if they're never able to mate, they can't pass on their genes for not being aggressive. On the other hand, if there are elephant seals who are very aggressive, they have a gene that leads them to be very aggressive and violent, then those elephant seals are going to tend to win those battles. And if they win the battles, they're able to mate with the females. And because they're mating with the females, they pass on their genes for being aggressive. So what that means is that there's this evolutionary pressure for the males of these species to get stronger and bigger and more aggressive, because those are the only males that win these fights. But because the females aren't competing with one another for access to the males, the females, if they're not fighting, there's no pressure for them to get stronger and more aggressive. So as a consequence, the idea is that in any species in which the females are choosier than the males in terms of choosing sexual partners, the males who have to compete with one another will tend to get bigger and stronger and larger over time. So in other words, physical differences in size in humans and in physical and differences in aggression between men and women and humans can be traced back to the fact that in our evolutionary past, women were choosier when deciding who to have sex with than men. Kind of interesting. There's a number of pieces of evidence that are consistent with an evolutionary framework for thinking about aggression. One that's commonly brought up is that it is extremely rare for parents to be physically abusive to the point where they kill their offspring when we're talking about their genetic offspring. And this should make sense in terms of an evolutionary perspective. Because if I have a gene and that gene basically says, kill your kids, well, what's going to happen is that if I have kids, I kill them, and that gene will never get passed on because all my kids are dead, right? So that gene will die out immediately. But if I have a gene that says, love your children and take care of them and nurture them, well, then it means that I'm going to raise these kids, and I'm going to protect them, and they're going to survive. And so they're going to have that gene that says, protect your kids, so that when they have kids, they're going to protect their kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that gene is going to spread through a population. Okay. On the other hand, or I should say, what researchers have shown then is that children who are living with step-parents are something up to 100 times more likely to be fatally abused than children living with both biological parents. But I want to make sure this is clear that living with a step-parent doesn't mean you're at a high risk of being killed by your step-parent. It's still a very, very, very small risk. But even that very small risk is 100 times larger than the minuscule risk of being fatally abused by your biological parents. And again, that's because we should have genes that say protect your biological offspring, because that would allow those genes to survive and be passed on. So the evolutionary theory of aggression is the main theory that takes the perspective that aggression has some sort of biological basis. But there are also theories that say that aggression can also be learned, and that's almost certainly true as well. There are some researchers who point out that aggression differs according to what are called cultures of honor. So cultures of honor are cultures that exist all around the world that basically put a large importance on honor. And the idea is that if your honor or your reputation, if you're being insulted and it's called into question, then you need to restore that honor. And one way to restore that honor is by being aggressive. So for instance, in this country, the US, there are little pockets of different sort of cultural ideas all around the country. And in particular, in the South of the US, exists sort of a culture of honor like this. So by the South, I mean places like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, northern Florida. Florida's kind of weird in the sense that it's only northern Florida that's part of the South. Southern Florida, where we are, is not part of the South, but northern Florida is. So it's the only place in the country where we have to drive north to get to the South, weirdly. But in any case, in the southern US exists sort of a subculture that's different than other parts of the country. And so what some researchers wanted to see was whether in the South, people would behave aggressively if their honor or their reputation was insulted, more so than people from the North. That's what they wanted to test. And the idea being that if it's the case that the subculture in the South behaves more aggressively than people in the North, then that would strongly suggest that to some degree, aggression is a learned behavior. because it's not like our genes are significantly different whether you're in the North or the South US. So that would suggest that it's a learned behavior. And so they conducted what I think is a really, really interesting study. Here's what they did. All the participants in this study were males that were either from the Southern US or from the Northern US. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through the study from the perspective of a participant. So imagine that you show up to a lab, and when you get to that lab, you've got to walk down a really narrow hallway to get to the main door to get into the lab. Okay. And as you're walking down that hallway, there is a filing cabinet, and there's a guy at the filing cabinet with a drawer open. And the only way for you to get past that guy is if he closes the filing cabinet drawer and moves out of your way so you can get past him. So what happens is that as you're walking up to this guy at the filing cabinet, he sees you coming and he gets kind of annoyed. And he kind of shuts the filing cabinet door and he gets out of your way. He kind of grumbles that you've sort of annoyed him to get past him. Okay? But you don't think too much about it. So you get into the room where the study is, and the researcher introduces himself and says, okay, for one part of the study, we're gonna have to take a saliva sample because we're measuring cortisol levels and things like that. And that's gonna be done in a room down the hall. So we need you to leave this room, go back down the hall to a different room. And so you leave that room, you start walking down this narrow hall again, but this guy is still there at the filing cabinet. At this point, you are randomly assigned to one of two conditions: to either be insulted by this guy or not. If you're not insulted by him, then he gets out of your way, you walk by him. Okay. If you are insulted, if you're randomly assigned to the condition where you're insulted by him, then what happens is that as you're passing by, he looks at you again, he slams the filing cabinet drawer shut, and he gets out of your way, and as you walk by, he bumps into you with his shoulder. And when you turn back to look at him, he looks at you and he says, "You asshole." Okay, that's what he says. Now, at this point, there's basically two reactions that people can have to being insulted in that way. One reaction is to get really angry, and like you might want to fight this guy or something. So you look back at him with anger. The other reaction is that you think like, what an idiot this guy is. You have like a look of amusement, like, who are you, right? And so what happens is that when you look back at this guy who just called you an asshole, there's someone else sitting in the hallway who's pretending to do some homework, but actually it's working as part of the experiment. And their job is simply to look at your face when you turn back and record it for how angry you seem. All right, so we'll come back to that in a second. So you walk down the hallway, you get to a second room, and in the second room, they take a saliva sample where they're gonna measure cortisol levels, and cortisol is related to anger and things like that. So they're partly doing this to see how angry you got as a function of being insulted by this guy. But also, when you get to the second room, you're met there by an experimenter who shakes your hand. And the experimenter is actually measuring how strongly you're shaking his hand. Are you squeezing it tight, or is it a loose handshake? We'll get back to that in a second too. Then you have to do a series of tasks in this lab, including things like the experimenter will tell you the beginning of a story, and you've got to complete the story. And the story is this. These are all men, remember, participants. So they say this: imagine that you're at a party and you're there with your girlfriend. And your girlfriend comes to you at some point and says, "Look, this guy, Rick, he's been hitting on me all night. It's really annoying. I really wish he'd leave me alone." And then 10 minutes later, sure enough, there you see Rick trying to hit on your girlfriend. Now finish that story. Now what the researchers want to know is, will people finish that story with acts of aggression? Like, I'm going to go beat the hell out of Rick or something. Or will they end that story with something else, with some other way to resolve the conflict? Now what they basically showed is that people from the North, regardless of whether they're insulted or not, doesn't really make them angrier. In other words, they don't show heightened levels of cortisol if they've been insulted or anything like that. They're not more likely to fill in that story with an act of aggression. But what happens is that people from the South react very differently. People from the South, if they've been insulted, then suddenly their cortisol levels shoot through the roof because they're really angry. When they look back at the person who insulted them, the guy who records their facial expression tends to record them as looking really, really angry. When they get to the next room, if they've been insulted and the experimenter shakes their hand, they grab onto that hand and squeeze it really hard. They tend to fill in that story with, "I would beat the crap out of Rick if he hits on my girlfriend again," et cetera, et cetera. Basically, the idea is that people from the South have, because they come from a culture of honor, have this sort of honor or reputation that they feel has been insulted if this other person called them an asshole, right? And if they feel it's been insulted, then they need a way to regain that honor. And one way to regain that honor is to become more aggressive. That's why they squeeze the experimenter's hand. That's why their cortisol levels shoot up. That's why they fill in the end of the story with "I beat the crap out of Rick." So what the researchers are basically showing is that being insulted doesn't really affect people from the north as much, but it really affects people from the south. It makes them really angry because of this culture of honor that they came from. But what is, I think, the most interesting part of the study is that after people leave that room, they start walking down this narrow hallway again. And as they're walking down the hallway, someone comes from around a corner and starts walking directly at them. Now that person's working with the experimenter, and they've been instructed to walk directly at the participant and to not move. So basically, these two people, the participant and the one person working with the confederate, are playing like a walking game of chicken. They're walking directly at each other. Now, what the researchers want to know is, at what point will the real participant, this person here, at what point will they get out of the way and let the person pass? And what they showed is that people from the north, doesn't matter if you were insulted or not, they get out of the way fairly easily and let the other person pass by. But among the participants who are from the south, and if they had just been insulted, they just walk directly up to the guy to the right in the face and then get out of the way. It's, again, another way of sort of showing dominance. Okay? If their reputation or their honor had been insulted, they need to restore it, which they do by showing dominance against other people. So it's not just the case that people from the south are more aggressive than people from the north. That's not true. In fact, if anything, if they haven't been insulted, people from the south are really, really polite and not aggressive at all. It's sometimes called like Southern hospitality. They're very polite. It's only if they've been insulted that people from the south tend to respond with more aggression than people from the north, in an attempt to restore the honor that had been impugned, that had been insulted by someone else. Okay, so that suggests then that people from the south have learned to respond to insults, to provocation with aggression. And so therefore, aggressive behavior can be learned. Similarly, we can see that aggressive behavior can be learned through a process of operant conditioning. So we saw earlier in this class when we looked at attitudes, what operant conditioning was. That's the idea that if you're rewarded for a behavior, that increases your likelihood of engaging in that behavior in the future. And if you're punished for a behavior, that decreases your likelihood of performing that behavior in the future. And that same principle applies to aggression as well. So for instance, if you have a child who's growing up, and let's say this child, Timmy, and he hits his sister. And by hitting his sister, he's able to steal her toy. Well, he was just rewarded for behaving aggressively. That teaches him that he can behave aggressively to get what he wants. And so therefore, he should become more aggressive over time. On the other hand, if Timmy hits his sister and he's immediately punished by his parents for doing so, then he's been punished for behaving aggressively. That should make him less likely to engage in aggressive in the future. Okay. So again, we're seeing that what that means is that aggression can be learned in that sense. This is effectively why some people argue that we shouldn't negotiate with terrorists. This was kind of a movie trope or cliche for a while. Now, we do negotiate with terrorists as a country. That does actually happen. But some people argue that we shouldn't negotiate with terrorists. And the reason for that is because if you negotiate with terrorists, then you're effectively giving them what they want in response to them being aggressive. That teaches them that being aggressive can lead them to get what they want in the future. And so by negotiating with them, that might increase the likelihood of terrorist acts in the future. And all of this raises an interesting question, which is this one here. What if you have a child who is punished for acting aggressively by being spanked? Well, spanking is a form of aggression. I mean, it meets all four components of that definition of aggression, right? It's a behavior with a goal to harm a living being, not permanently harm, hopefully, but at least in the short term, it's unpleasant. So it's aimed at harming a living being who's motivated to avoid it. That counts as aggression. And so the question is, what if children are taught not to behave aggressively via aggressive means, i.e. by being spanked? What will happen? Will being spanked decrease their likelihood of aggression, or will it increase their likelihood of aggression? Let's look at that. Well, notice that this question is a causal question, right? The question is, does spanking lead kids to behave more or less aggressively? That's a causal question. And as we've seen, in order to answer a causal question requires an experiment. And an experiment requires that people be randomly assigned to different levels of the independent variable. Well, in this case, in order to do an experiment on the effects of spanking, what that means is we would have to randomly assign kids to be either spanked or not, which we cannot do for ethical reasons. We cannot hit kids, obviously. So what that means is we cannot conduct a true experiment looking at the effects of spanking on aggression for ethical reasons. So what researchers have done is they have used other types of methodologies to look at this question. So here's an example of a study that researchers have conducted. Okay. What they've done is they've looked at the number of times a kid was spanked by their parents in their own home. So the experimenters didn't do it themselves. They're looking at the number of times the parents spanked this child. And they looked at whether these kids were spanked 0, 1, 2, or 3 times on average per week. Now what they did is they measured these kids' antisocial tendencies, which is basically roughly a measure of aggression, at 2 different time points. So imagine that they do this at 2 time points 1 year apart. So they do it in 2019 and then they do it in 2020, let's say. What you can do is then you can look at the change in this antisocial score. And that's what we're looking at here in the y-axis, a change in that antisocial score. What that means is that if they're above 0, that means they got more aggressive over time. If they're below 0, that means they got less aggressive over time. Okay? Now, what this study is showing is that if you look just at the kids who were never spanked, so the parents never spanked these kids naturally got less aggressive over time. Now, this makes sense to a certain extent, because what happens is that if you look at the most aggressive people on Earth, the most aggressive people on Earth aren't terrorists or biker gangs or anything like that. The most aggressive people on Earth are children. Now, they don't do nearly as much harm as terrorists or gangs or whatever, but they're really, really aggressive in terms of the number of aggressive instances, like way more aggressive than terrorists and things like that. But what happens is that children learn via a socialization process, they learn that they can't simply act aggressively all the time. So as a consequence, naturalistically, kids tend to get somewhat less aggressive over time. And that's what we're seeing here, is that natural socialization practice. Okay? They're getting less aggressive over time. However, if these kids were spanked on a regular basis, they tend to get more aggressive over time. And the more times they were spanked, the more aggressive they get. Okay, that's why this line is sloping up and to the right. So what these data are suggesting is that being spanked might lead kids to become more aggressive over time. Now, we can't actually say that because this isn't a true experiment, so we can't technically make causal claims. So it's only suggestive of that. But it's at least consistent with the idea that being spanked increases the likelihood that people will behave aggressively over time. So why is that the case? If it were the case that being spanked leads people to behave aggressive over time, why? Well, one of the dominant theories that we have to explain why aggression might lead people to become more aggressive over time came out in the 1970s. At the time, it was basically believed that most behaviors are purely the result of being rewarded or punished, that's the operant conditioning process. But in the 70s, a researcher by the name of Albert Bandura came around. And he said that, yes, that can happen. We can learn behaviors by being punished or rewarded for engaging in certain behaviors. But we can also learn to engage in certain behaviors simply by observing other people. And that forms the basis of what he called social learning theory. So the basic idea here is that social behavior, such as aggression, can be learned simply by watching other people behave in the same way. So what that means as far as aggression is concerned is that if you have a child and they are observing their parents behave aggressively, then they start to learn that, well, my parents are getting what they want by behaving aggressively. Therefore, I can learn to behave aggressively to get what I want in the future as well. Okay? So to the extent that that's true, that would explain why spanking might lead kids to become more aggressive, because they're observing that their parent is getting what they want by using aggression. And therefore, they learn that they can get what they want by using aggression as well. And that leads to a really famous study that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with from maybe an intro psych class or a developmental psych class or something like that, which is his famous Bobo doll study. Let me describe to you what happens in this study, okay? And I'm going to simplify it a little bit, but here's the basic idea. It's a very simple idea. So you have a bunch of kids, and you randomly assign them to one of two conditions. For half of the kids, they're randomly assigned to a condition in which they watch a video, a short video, a few minutes long, of an adult woman hitting a Bobo doll. Now, a Bobo doll is basically like, it's kind of like a life-size doll, but it's like a balloon with weighted feet. And so if you punch the balloon, it'll fall down, but it'll pop back up again, like that, okay? So half of the kids watch a video of a woman hitting this Bobo doll and throwing it up in the air and sitting on it and punching it in its nose and things like that. The other half of the kids don't see this video. All of these kids, one at a time, are then allowed to go enter this room. And in this room, there's a number of toys that they can play with, including a Bobo doll and including things like guns and other toys that are related to aggression that way. Now, what Albert Bandura was interested in and what he was testing with the study was whether the kids who had just observed a video of someone behaving aggressively towards a Bobo doll, whether they will themselves behave more aggressively towards that Bobo doll, or whether they'd be more likely to use guns or things like that. Will watching that video of someone else behaving aggressively lead these kids to behave aggressively themselves? That's the basic idea. So I have a video from the study. I believe you should be able to hear my audio. But let me pull that up so you can see exactly what he was looking at. As I said, you should be able to hear this. If not, let me know in the chat.
Pummeled a doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied play materials, and children could choose to play aggressively or non-aggressively. The children devised new ways of hitting the doll. Now, the object of interest was the novel aggressive acts, not punching the doll. Children in the control group who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling never exhibited the novel forms of aggression. And here's a creative embellishment. A doll becomes a weapon of assault.
Okay, so that girl is so cute but so mean, just like my ex-girlfriend, I think. Okay. Okay. Who knows? Maybe that was a video of my ex-girlfriend when she was a child. That would make a lot of sense. Okay. So the basic idea, of course, here is that just being exposed to someone who's behaving aggressively can lead people to behave aggressively themselves, even if they're not directly rewarded or punished for those behaviors. By the way, I just want to point something out here, which is that according to the operational definition I gave you, remember that aggression only counts, or we're only going to consider it aggression if it's directed at a living being, right? Well, in this study, that was not directed at a living being. A bobodal is an inanimate object. Now, the reason for the discrepancy is that in the late 60s, early 70s, when this theory was being developed, we hadn't figured out that we needed that operational definition as of yet. So it's only after that experiment came out that we realized that we need to be studying aggression that's aimed at a living being. And so we wouldn't use the same methodology today. So what happens now, when people study aggression, there's a couple of different techniques that they use, but they have some interesting ones. So in some studies of aggression, what they do is they seat people at two different computer stations in different rooms. And at various times, you're able to blast the other person with some like really loud white noise through their headphones. And you can decide how loud you want to blast them with that white noise. So that way, that behavior is being directed at another living being. So how high they set that noise level is a measure of how aggressive they're being. Other studies have done things where people have been allowed to make their partner or whoever they're working with drink hot sauce, and they can decide how much hot sauce they want to make them drink. And the amount of hot sauce they decide to make them drink is a measure of aggression. Now, they may not actually have them drink the hot sauce, right? But the idea is that by determining how much hot sauce they want the other person to drink, that basically is a proxy for how much pain they want the other person to be in. So it's directed towards another living being. So that's how they tend to measure aggression. And there's a few other ways as well that they do today. Okay. But clearly then, aggressive behavior can be learned in a number of different ways. And you can learn aggressive behavior via social learning theory from your parents or just from the media, right? That if you're seeing people use aggression on TV or in the movies, then according to social learning theory, that can lead people to learn to use aggression themselves in their own lives. Okay, so we can learn aggressive behavior from aggressive models, people who are modeling that behavior. This would also partly explain the cycle of violence that you sometimes see from generation to generation, where kids who are physically abused by their own parents are more likely to abuse their own children. And you might think that, well, how does that make sense? Because if children are physically abused, they know the suffering they went through. It seems to me they might be less willing to inflict it on their own kids. But what really happens is that by being physically abused, you learn that other people can use aggression to get what they want. And that means you can use aggression to get what you want. So it leads to this cycle where violence begets violence. Okay, so we've looked at either biological theories or learned theories of the origins of aggression, but I also want to talk about certain situational factors that can lead people to behave more or less aggressively. And there's a bunch of situational factors that do this, but there's a couple in particular I want to focus on. One of those is arousal. So we've seen before that when people are in a physiologically aroused state, that if they come across someone, they're more likely to think they're attracted to that person because they misattribute the source of their arousal to being attracted to that person, right? So we talked about the study where people crossed a shaky bridge, and these men who had crossed a shaky bridge were nervous because they crossed a shaky bridge. In other words, they had heightened levels of physiological arousal. When they met an attractive woman, they believed they were more attracted to her than they really were, because they noticed that their heart was beating quickly and their palms were sweaty, and they started to think, oh, I must really be attracted to this woman, when in fact it was really the bridge that caused that. But the same sort of principles can apply in terms of aggression as well. So in other words, if we feel physiologically aroused, whether it's due to violent movies or exercise or crossing a shaky bridge or caffeine from coffee that we had or whatever, that physiological arousal is heightened within us. If someone comes along and does something which would ordinarily just be a little bit annoying, let's say, well, if we're in a heightened physiological state, we might start thinking, man, my heart's beating really quickly and I'm really shaky. Why? It must be because I'm really angry at this person. And as a consequence, people might lash out physically at that person. They might behave more aggressively against that person. So it's the same principle that explains why being in a heightened physiological state can increase the degree to which you think you're attracted to someone. The same principle that explains why being in a heightened physiological state can lead people to behave more aggressively to someone else. So all that means is that physiological arousal can be misattributed as being attraction, as being anger, depending on the situation that you tend to find yourself in. So for instance, this is a study that tested this idea. And what they did is they had participants either exercise or not. They're randomly assigned to this condition. Now, of course, people who exercise by, let's say, jogging in place for 2 minutes, their heartbeat's going to be raised up. They're going to be in a heightened physiological state, right? They are then either angered by someone or not angered by them. And there's a number of ways that researchers can do this. Sometimes studies will they'll have participants write an essay and then they get really negative feedback from someone else, which tends to anger people. So they're either angered or not by another person. And then the participant is allowed to deliver shocks, or they think they can deliver shocks, to the person, to their partner, to the other participant. So what we're looking at here is a measure of aggression, which is how strong of a shock they wanted to deliver to that other person. Now in the condition, now of course we should say that if you're angered by someone, regardless of whether you exercise or not, if you're angered by someone, you're more likely to deliver stronger shocks to them, right? You tend to be aggressive towards that person. We don't like when people anger us. We try to lash out at them. That's certainly the case, and that's what we're seeing here. But what's interesting and what's relevant to what we're talking about now is that this effect is even stronger among people who just exercised, right? It's only a small increase in the shock level if you didn't exercise. It's a really big increase in the shock level if you did exercise. The reason being because these people who just exercised, if someone comes along and angers them in some way, they start thinking, wow, my heart's beating really fast. My physiological arousal levels are really up. I must really be angry at this person. So they deliver really strong shock levels. Okay? So the arousal that had been created from exercise was being misattributed as being anger towards the other person, and therefore people retaliated by delivering strong shocks. And this general concept can explain an interesting finding, which is the relationship between heat and aggression. Because researchers noticed through a number of different studies and methodologies that there does seem to be a link between heat and aggression. In other words, people are more likely to behave aggressively when they're hot versus when they're not hot. So there's some pieces of evidence that are drawn from the real world. For instance, the fact that there are more violent crimes that are committed in the summer than in any other season, than in other months. So for instance, this is a study that looked at the number of violent crimes, rapes, assaults, disturbances, uprisings, as a function of the season. And what you can see is they all tend to peak in the summer, and they're at their lowest point in the winter. Right? Now, there's obviously a couple of reasons why this could be the case. It could be the case that because in most parts of the country, not here, but in most parts of the country, it's really cold in the winter, and so people stay indoors, so there might be less opportunity. But it's also consistent with the idea that because it's hotter in the summer, people are more aggressive and more violent, and so there's more crimes committed in the summer than in other months. This is a study that looked at baseball games. And what they looked at is the likelihood that a pitcher would hit a batter with a pitch as a function of the temperature outside. Okay? So this y-axis is basically the likelihood that a pitcher hits a batter. And what they showed is that the hotter it is outside, the more likely a pitcher is to hit a batter with a pitch, which is consistent with the idea that when it's hot outside, pitchers are being more aggressive and they're aiming for the batters more. Now, there is one alternative explanation. Maybe it's possible that this has nothing to do with aggression. Maybe what these data show is that when it's really hot outside, pitchers just get wilder. They can't control their pitches as much. And so they're hitting the batters by accident because they're becoming wilder. So to look into this idea, the researchers also looked to see whether pitchers were more likely to throw wild pitches when it was hotter outside. And they show that there was no effect of that. So in other words, when it gets hotter, pitchers don't just become wilder in general, but they are more likely to hit batters, which suggests that when it gets really hot outside, pitchers are more likely to aim for batters and hit them with pitches. So it's consistent with the idea that heat is causing aggression in some way. And we've also seen that following provocation, following an insult, Southerners are more violent than Northerners. That's not true if they haven't been insulted or has been damaged their reputation, but if they have been insulted, that tends to be true. There's studies that show even if you look within the same city, so if you looked within Miami, for instance, there tend to be more violent crimes during the hotter summer months than there are during the cooler winter months. Or sorry, I should say, during hotter summers than during cooler summers on a year-to-year basis. So again, all of these lines of evidence are suggestive and consistent with the idea that heat can cause aggression. But of course, in order to establish an actual causal effect, we need to have an actual experiment where we randomly assign people to a condition in which they're either in a hot room or not a hot room, and then they're able to behave aggressively. And when you conduct those causal experimental studies, you show that indeed it is the fact that people who are in a hotter room tend to behave more aggressively than people who are in a cooler room. So why is that the case? Why does heat increase aggression? Well, the main idea here, the main reasoning for why heat increases aggression is based on the idea of misattribution of arousal. Because we know that heat, high temperatures, tend to increase physiological arousal. However, it doesn't seem like that's the case. Our common sense would say, well, if it's really hot outside, you don't even want to move. You're just kind of lying there in the sun, right? So people tend to think that heat lowers arousal levels. So what that means is that if you're outside on a hot summer day and someone comes along and does something that annoys you, well, now you start noticing all this physiological arousal, right? You're feeling like, why is my heart beating so quickly? Why am I physiologically aroused? And you're not going to attribute it to the heat because you think heat lowers arousal, right? You don't think heat causes arousal. So you're not going to attribute it to what actually caused it. So now you're really looking for a reason. What caused this physiological arousal? Well, you know what? This person just annoyed me. It must be because I'm really angry at them. I must really be angry at them. So people are more likely to lash out and behave aggressively. Okay? So arousal that's actually caused by heat can very easily be misattributed to anger, which therefore increases aggression. Okay, so that's the basic explanation for how heat can lead to aggression. Let's look at a couple of other situational factors that can influence aggression as well. One of those is alcohol. So in other words, people who have been drinking tend to be more aggressive than people who have not. At least if someone antagonizes them, that's the case, on average. And there are at least 3 explanations for why this is the case. Okay, first off, one of the effects that alcohol has, as I'm sure many people know, is to weaken your inhibitions. Now, what that means is that, let's say that you're in a situation where someone does something that's kind of annoying to you. Well, you may want to harm that person, but you know you can't because you live in a society, a civilized society, right? You can't just go around hitting everybody whenever someone annoys you, right? So you have these inhibitions against the behaviors that you might want to engage in. But when you've been drinking, alcohol reduces those inhibitions. So it's not that alcohol is leading you to become aggressive, but rather alcohol is weakening the inhibitions that normally keep you from behaving aggressively. As a consequence, your true feelings, which might be aggressive in nature, are more likely to come out if you've been drinking. So that's one way that alcohol can lead to an increase in aggression, by weakening your inhibitions. It's not the only way, though, because another effect that alcohol has is to narrow your focus. So at any given time, you might be aware of multiple things going on around you at once, right? You might be listening to me and looking at the slides and taking notes and paying attention to your phone, and there might be a bunch of things going on. But what happens is that if you've been drinking, you simply don't have the cognitive resources to pay attention to all of those things. So your attention has to narrow. You can only focus on like one thing at a time, okay? Now this has some important implications, because let's say that you were at a bar, and once you leave the bar, you're walking down the road and someone bumps into you. Okay? Under normal circumstances, now we do have a tendency to engage in the fundamental attribution error, right? To attribute their behavior to their personality, but we don't always have to do that. If we can recognize that maybe that person tripped and they bumped into you accidentally, well, you're not going to fight them because they did it accidentally, right? But that requires you to be able to see how the situation might have affected their behavior. But if you've been drinking, we just don't have the cognitive resources. We can't focus on all those things. So when someone bumps into you, you notice they bump into you, but you don't have the cognitive wherewithal to realize that they just accidentally fell into you. You don't have enough cognitive resources or cognitive functioning. As a consequence, you're more likely to engage in the fundamental attribution error, to attribute that behavior to their personality, and therefore to be more likely to be aggressive against that person. Okay, so we're less likely to override that aggressive impulse. And a third reason that alcohol can increase aggression is simply due to expectations, or placebo effects, I guess. If people expect that alcohol makes them more aggressive, then if they think they've been drinking alcohol, they will tend to behave in a manner consistent with those expectations. And there are some interesting studies where you can lead people to think that they're drinking alcohol. So you can give them a drink and you can tell them alcohol's in it, and you put maybe a little tiny bit of alcohol around the rim so it smells like alcohol, and you have them drink it. Now, in reality, they basically have no alcohol in them. But if people think they've been drinking, they start behaving as if they were drunk, right? Because they start behaving in line with their expectations about how they think alcohol affects them. And so if they believe that alcohol leads them to behave aggressively, then people will start behaving aggressively just because that's their expectation. So for all these reasons, alcohol can increase aggression. One of the originally studied factors, situational factors, that can increase aggression, and this goes back to like the 1920s, I believe it is. One of the original factors that researchers looked at that affect aggression is frustration. Now, by frustration, what researchers typically mean is that if you're trying to obtain a goal and something blocks you from attaining that goal, then we would say you're frustrated. So it's just something that blocks you from attaining a goal. And what some researchers said in the 1920s in particular, or what they came up with, was what's called the frustration-aggression hypothesis. And according to the frustration-aggression hypothesis, frustration and aggression are inextricably linked. What that means is two things. First off, that when you experience frustration, that always leads to the aggression motivation, the motivation to aggress, okay? So I'll give you an example. According to these researchers, what they would say is, let's say at work, you were up for a promotion. It was between you and a coworker, and you didn't get the promotion, your coworker did, okay? Well, you've been frustrated in the sense that you had a goal, you wanted to be promoted, and something blocked you, your boss blocked you from being promoted. So you were frustrated. According to these researchers, what they would say is that frustration leads to the motivation to aggress. Now, you can't necessarily take it out on your boss, but it leads you to want to aggress against someone. They would say, and the strong form of this argument, they would say that if you're frustrated, that always leads to the motivation to aggress in every situation. The second component of the frustration-aggression hypothesis is that if you do see aggression in someone, it's always the result of frustration. They would say there was nothing else that could cause frustration, nothing else that could cause aggression other than being frustrated at some point in the past. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say that frustration and aggression are inextricably linked according to this hypothesis. Now, this hypothesis is associated with a couple of different ideas. So one idea it's associated with is something called displacement. So in the example I just used, where you're up for promotion and your boss doesn't give it to you, they give it to your coworker. So you have this motivation to aggress. But you can't take it out on your boss for social reasons and for work reasons and blah, blah, blah. But you still have this motivation to aggress. So what you do, maybe you go home and you yell at your kids. So the frustration that was caused by your boss not giving you the promotion, you're taking out on a different target. You're taking it out on your kids. That's something called displacement. And according to these researchers, if you engage in displacement, that can result in what's called catharsis, which is a reduction in this aggressive urge. Okay, in other words, you're really angry because you didn't get a promotion. You go home, you yell at your kids, and by yelling at your kids, that reduces your frustration level. That's the idea. Okay, and this idea of catharsis is well known in this culture. A lot of people have this belief, and we have lots of phrases that are based on the belief of catharsis. So the idea that you should vent your anger, for instance, is based on the idea of catharsis. The idea is that aggression builds up, and if you can release it against the substitute target, you can reduce it. And there are certain therapies, there are a little more fringe therapies maybe, but there are certain therapies that are based on this idea as well, where if you have anger built up inside of you, then if you hit a pillow repeatedly, that'll reduce your anger through this process of catharsis.